So today we're starting off with a little brief overview of our more local area, so Texas government in general, and how science may translate into policy on these sort of local and state levels. And we have two fantastic speakers today, Dr. Larry McKinney and Norman Garza, who I will give brief introductions of at the start of each section. So please make sure you're sort of keeping track of what we're doing and posting your questions for each of those speakers as we go. So without further ado, I'd like to get started. Larry McKinney is the current chair of Gulf of Mexico strategies at the Harte Research Institute for the Gulf of Mexico. Dr. Larry McKinney received his Ph.D. in zoology from Texas A&M University in 1976. He retired as the senior executive director of the Harte Research Institute at Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi in 2020, and is currently the chair for Gulf strategies at HRI. Over his 50-year career, 25 years as a researcher and 25 years as a resource manager and regulator, McKinney has secured some $186 million in research and conservation funding and spent nearly 7.5 months underwater completing over 8,000 dives. Dr. McKinney serves on the Florida Institute of Oceanography Board of Visitors and Florida's Restore Center of Excellence, the Texas State Aquarium Board, and the Texas State Audubon Board of Directors. While McKinney has contributed many scientific and peer-reviewed articles like his 2020 overview of the Gulf of Mexico, he is better known for many of his articles translating science into English, such as the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department magazine article, Texas Dead Zones. So without further ado, Dr. Larry McKinney, you're welcome to sort of begin.
Hey, Tacey, thanks for the introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. If I can figure out how to share screens now, we will make this work. Does that work? Is that sharing now?
Yep, I can see your screen.
Thank you. Okay, so, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this as a topic that's really near and dear to me because of my kind of unusual career, mostly split between academics and agencies, and hopefully I've learned a little bit during that time, so hope to share with you. Make sure to get this here. Okay, slides advancing, okay. Okay, so when you start something like this, I guess you should make the point that you actually know what you're talking about a little bit. So as Stacy said, have been around for about 50 years, and half of that as a resource manager at Parks and Wildlife primarily, and the rest of it is at the Institute here or in academic side of things. So it does give me some kind of perspective to talk from. And over that time, I've hired 80 or so professionals, probably more really, and certainly approved processes for several hundred others. So I have some concept of how young academics in particular coming into an agency or something, things that might be useful. So I'm going to try to talk about that a bit. And so here's my presentation outline. I've divided up in several parts. One, how can scientists effectively translate their research into impactful policy and management decisions of resource agencies, state and local? Do universities facilitate academic participation, policy development, and management actions of those same agencies? What do I need to know for a successful career in resource agencies? And then how does all this work in Texas? So let's take a look at that first one. And I'm going to use the Harte Research Institute here, which basically is a $46 million experiment in translating science into policy and action using the following working hypothesis that traditional academic-based research models are really failing on many levels, and a more proactive and agile construct is needed to assure relevance of science and management and policy. And one of the reasons that I left Parks and Wildlife after 23 years was the opportunity to come here at the Harte Research Institute, where this was the idea was to try to take science and solve problems focused on the Gulf of Mexico. So I liked that opportunity. And so as we began work here, I really began development on what we have now called the HRI model, which is a way of doing just that, of taking a science to policy and to action. And basically it's a three-part step where really the first part is trying to understand and define issues. And we come at it in the way that we're not a research organization that is a solution in search of a problem. We really do try to look at, talk to those, engage with stakeholders and others to try to understand problems. Then we try to bring science to bear to actually solve those problems. The second part of that was to study and solve problems, and we understand that we may not have the tools or knowledge to solve a particular problem, but we know who may. And finally, this community engagement, which is something that most academics don't do, which is to take that science and actually apply it. And that's where it gets kind of messy and political and that type of thing. And that's a big learning curve for us. But if you're successful, then you really begin to do what I think an important role, one of the important roles of universities, and that is to help solve important societal problems. And you saw the term engagement all the way through there, and that's something that I think that we have to think about. Then encouraging, facilitating engagement is fundamental to this idea of converting science into policy and action, because you have to be able to be engaged with those who know the problem, who can help you solve the problem, and then most importantly, to implement the results that you come up with. And when we talk about engagement or co-production, that's another term for engagement. That is not, for example, sending an agency your peer-reviewed paper at the end of your project. It's a much more involved situation than that. So you really have to focus on it. And we can talk more about that if someone's interested. The other part of that is kind of what holds it all together, is that we do have in the institute brought together chairs in chemistry and biology and biodiversity and those types of things. But we also set up chairs, and which are somewhat unusual at the time when we were doing this, but there's more and more institutes that have them, who have brought together experts, scientists in socioeconomics, marine policy, and law, and to work together to solve problems. And these chairs have been kind of the glue that have held the institute together and brought our different science teams together. And of course, we're all in the same building. So that has really helped. Our students and our chairs are all working together, and that has helped a lot in that regard. And it's worked for us. Just from the numbers side, when we started in 2008, we had 37 staff and students, 145 or so today. We had about 10 research programs going in 2008, 85 today, and our budget's grown to 31 million. Now, those are just numbers. The real point of this is outcomes. And we've been successful in using this model and approach to reach international agreements, for example, between the U.S. and Cuba, the only agreement that has been reached since the Cuban Missile Crisis, to look at sister sanctuaries between our two countries and look at common issues there. We used our science and a number of us testifying before the U.S. House and Senate to get the Modern Fish Act passed in 2018, the only bipartisan fisheries management act that's come out of Washington in many years. And then recently helping establish aquaculture in the state of Texas as an alternative to the destructive harvest of oysters. Our chairs wrote legislation and then testified and worked to get that done. And finally, a sea level rise for the state of Texas, which we started some 12 years ago, back when there were some agencies in which you could not write the term climate change, but we started that project with private funding, and today it's being underwritten by the General Land Office. So the point of all of this in this quick episode is just to tell you that, yes, you can. There are ways that academia can take the science that they're developing and actually apply it to solving problems. This is one model. There are others, but it can work, but it does take some effort to make it successful. So let's go to the second part of the outline. Do universities facilitate academic participation in policy development and management actions of those same agencies? Briefly, really, the answer is no, not so much. And that's an issue that has been recognized in this particular writing over in the UK, which says, at present, the metrics of scientific success used by most universities, citations, publications, and grant money, encourage this linear career path from postgraduate studies to a tenured position. And this is an issue just that has made it very difficult for academics. In fact, you're often punished if you try to stray outside those norms, or you're not rewarded at least. And for you diehard academics out there, here's a peer-reviewed paper that really states the same thing. It's been cited 26 times. It was published in the Palgrave's Communication, which is a humanities and social science journal. And it, as I said, it was cited 26 times, which will be important to something that comes up in a bit. But the whole point that came out of that paper, and we were able to bring together the former head of the National Science Foundation, the former director of Woods Hole Oceanographic, and others to help us take a look at this whole issue. And it really kind of reinforced what we had talked about with the HRI model, but particularly this issue of that is a real barrier to academics participating and taking their science and dealing with policy and working with agencies, is the fact that they really don't get rewarded for that. In fact, as it's sometimes punished. So that's a difficult journey to get across, and we've really not figured out a way to get past it, but it is certainly a big impediment going forward. And so we want to try to find ways to get past those barriers and get the academic sides more involved in research side in addressing these policy issues. And in terms of kind of bursting the academic bubble a little bit, I just wanted to make this point that globally now we have more than 2 million journal articles. They're published every year, and that's going to increase as we go forward. But one of the books by Derek Bach, who's the former president of Harvard University, took a look at that time at the journal articles, and one of his findings was that 98% of the articles published in the arts and humanities are never cited by another researcher. In social sciences, it's about 75% that are uncited. And even in the hard sciences, chemistry, biology, that type of thing, where 25% of the articles are never cited, the average citations is between 1 and 2. Or as Paige Smith, who's a longtime professor of history at the University of California, put it, the vast majority of so-called research turned out by the modern university is essentially worthless. It does not really result in any measurable benefit to anything or anybody. It's busy work on a vast and almost incomprehensible scale. So now that I've insulted the academic faculty, the faculty and so forth here, I'll just make the point that what I'm trying to make the point is that there's a lot of energy and brain power out there that, if properly focused, could do a lot of good if we could figure out a way to help facilitate that transfer of science into good policy. That's my basic soapbox on that. But now let's get to what I think most of you really wanted to talk about. That is, what do I need to know for a successful career in a resource agency, and how does all this work in Texas? And so the question being, do universities prepare students for careers in resource agencies? And as you might guess, again, the short answer is no, not really. Example we talk about in 2020, colleges and universities throughout the U.S. awarded about 42,000 PhDs for scientists and engineers. And that's really a fantastic news, as the report says. It represents a big leap from 1958 when there were only 6,000. But they also noted that many universities and colleges don't really publish data on the long-term career outcomes of graduate students the way they do for undergraduates. We always know where undergraduate students are going in engineering and law and business and this type of thing. So why are they ignoring advanced students? I think maybe it's because, as they say here, that if they were to print realities in their brochures, fewer graduate students may enroll in their programs. And the reason being is that of all those PhDs that are graduated, only 10 to 30% end up in a permanent position in academia. Often, and now many would like to be, almost 70% would like to work in academia, but the opportunities don't exist. So from 9 out of 10 to 7 out of 10 PhDs end up someplace else. And a number of those could be in resource agencies and that type of thing. But we train our scientists for an academic career, and that has changed. It has improved during my career, my 50 years. I've seen some improvements, but there's a lot of distance to go. And for you, those of you who are in the tracks now, looking forward, then what do you need to do? So what I'm going to do now is give you my best and until now secret advice for surviving the world outside academia, or at least being in a state agency. Some of what I've learned about my experiences in working in an agency and going back and forth with academia, and how you could be successful if you take up that opportunity. And if you're interested in a career more looking at taking science and applying it to solving problems, here's some points to be made. So if academia is not preparing you for what is more likely than not your career path, what can you do? Well, obviously, you need a sound resume, one that has the basic sciences, because if you're being a scientist, you need to have that evidence, to have those courses. So you need a resume like that. But the reality is, there are quite a few of those. There's a lot of resumes. When I used to look at hiring biologists and so forth, I would get 5 to 10 or even more really well qualified biologists from their background standpoint, from the CV. But so what you wanted to look for is what made an individual stand out, particularly a young scientist wanting to get into a resource agency where we need to be solving problems or addressing real resource issues. So what was the evidence that perhaps they had some experience in doing that? And if you can't get that in background in classes in this type of thing, well, you can certainly work you're on your own. Student organizations that get out and do activities or do restoration work or volunteer types of things, not just professional organizations, although those are really important, but you can certainly participate in those. There are local organizations like Audubon and TNC where you can volunteer and play an important role, or start something on your own. These are the types of things that agencies are looking for in resumes of outside a sound academic background going forward. And then on the far end of the scale, the really more sophisticated, and I think this is the top, but there are many of these, which is something like the Canals Marine Fellowships. The Canals Fellowships are, I think, on the very top end of it, but there's others, the National Academy of Science and so forth. So if coming out of academia, you have the time and ability to and can seek out and be successful in securing a fellowship like this, that's a wonderful transition to give you a good background going forward. So there's a few things like that that you can certainly do. And a really important aspect of turning science into policy and action is the communications. And then you want to be able to take advantage of opportunities you have to increase in those areas. And this was something that I really had to struggle with when I came out of academia into agencies, and because as a scientist, you always want to try to explain everything fully as you can. And the old saying is that when someone asks you what time it is, if you're a scientist, you're probably going to tell them the time, but you're also going to build the clock and perhaps talk about the theory behind time zones and this type of thing, when all they really wanted to know was what the time is. So that's an important area that you need to think about. And there are training programs and others that you can take advantage of to help you do that, but you have to be aware of it. The issue that I had most dealt with as a management agent at Parks and Wildlife, trying to translate science in front of our commission and leadership, was to try to give them an answer. And it took me a long time to sort out how to do this, because my commissioner finally got kind of frustrated with me one day when I was up in front of them, giving them some policy options of moving forward on some fisheries management issue. And the chairman said, Larry, I wish you were just a one-armed biologist, which kind of was a stunning statement to say, and it kind of threw me off. And I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, well, look, we know what you know. We know what you know what you're doing. We just want the answer, not a lot of options. Tell us what you think we should best do, because you're always saying on the one hand you could do this, on the other hand you could do that. Just give us the one answer that we can move forward with. We trust you with what you're doing. So you have to think about those types of things. Communication and how you talk is to your translate science is really important. Another aspect of this is people are the problem, but they are also the solution. And this was a question that I'm often asked, and particularly when I was at the department and giving talks at various universities to students that were looking for careers and jobs going forward. And they would always ask, well, what are the courses that I should take to best situate me to be competitive for a job at a state agency? And I know they expected this for me to talk about statistics and fisheries courses and this type of thing, but I always came back to try to make this point to them that in all the issues that I had dealt with and was dealing with actually at that time, most of my problems, 80% of the problems, were people issues rather than science issues. The science was pretty straightforward. All of us at the agency knew how to deal with scientific issues. We know that routine of how to go and try to solve those issues because that's how we were trained. But most of us really didn't have much people experience. And then when you're dealing with policy issues and resource agencies, it's mostly people issues. So I'd always suggest to the folks to try to add a few of those courses outside your major interest, particularly in the area of economics or socioeconomics. That would be a valuable tool to have available. And then this issue, and this is the most important one, I think, for me, it's the most significant, I think. So it may seem to you as an agency scientist, for example, that there's only one way to solve a problem, the one you recommended to your agency. But by the time it goes through the agency process, it may be very different and the answer may not be what you thought it should have been. And you feel the decision makers clearly didn't listen to you and they're mistaken, or at least that's how you see it as a scientist. And this is a really critical issue that many of the scientists that worked under me, some could deal with it and some couldn't. And the point just being is that, 1 + 2 + 3 equals 6, but so does 3 + 3. And the answers to the solution to a problem sometimes take in more aspect than you might think. And this is what I want to try to illustrate this with. This is today's Texas Parks and Wildlife Commission. There are 9 individuals that are appointed by the governor, and this is typical in state agencies in Texas and even in the federal agencies where you have for resource agencies, of course, you have the core of the agencies, which are professionals of all types, many scientists and this type of thing, but they're overseen by political appointees. In the case of Parks and Wildlife, it's 9 commissioners. The TCEQ has 3, and so on and so forth. And so what I've highlighted here in yellow are their educational backgrounds. And interestingly enough, there are the chairman, Beaver Applin, does have a Bachelor of Science from A&M, and Jeffrey Hildebrand is a geologist with a Bachelor of Sciences from the University of Texas. That is really unusual. I worked for some 65 or so commissioners over my career at Parks and Wildlife, and probably never had more than 2 or 3 total that had a science background. They were nearly always business people or attorneys or a broad background like that type of thing. So they really didn't have that science background. So it's pretty interesting in that regard. It's kind of a change. But the point being is that these individuals were put in their position to bring that different perspective to solving problems, so that so as scientists, the agency would bring forward, we would bring forward our best view, science-based answers, but they had different perspectives, different values perhaps. And so sometimes, that would change. They would go down a different path that would take those into consideration. So that's something that you had to learn. You have to learn how to live with, or if you can't, then perhaps you shouldn't be in the resource agency, because there's a broader perspective there, and that was a really important issue for us to think about. On the other hand, there are times that are pretty straightforward, and then there was a time when my program were developing freshwater inflows for all of the bays in Texas to try to protect the health of those systems and the fisheries in them. And we had released our recommendations for the amount of acre feet of water that should be freshwater should be going to each of the Texas bays. And as soon as I released that information, all the legislators and river authorities and so forth descended on me and really came after me, both personally and not only just professionally, but personally, because obviously this water was for fish and they needed that water for something else. And so at one day I was whining to the chair of the commission. I was just getting tired of being beat up on and threatened. And the chairman said just this quote here, says, "Larry, just remember," said, "Larry, it's not your science that they're arguing about. They just don't like the answer." And so I always thought that was a funny response, but it was settling, because I think it was exactly right. And it helped me make throughout the career, because I became an ace, as it were, in threatened to being fired over issues. And by the time I made my 5th one, we actually had a party. The 5th time a state legislator called me into their office and said, "If you don't change what you're doing, I'm going to have you fired." And so I became an ace, and believe me, I was an ace many times over the career in some regards. But the point was, but I still stayed at the agency. And that was where I think to get it back on the positive track of this thing is that the thing in agencies, it's a very different kind of career forward, but certainly in Parks and Wildlife, and I really think as many of the other agencies, as long as you could communicate to that political leadership what you were intending to do and how you would do it, and you kept them informed of what you're doing, they would have your back. And at Parks and Wildlife, they certainly had mine over those years, and I appreciate it much. And that's really the what I would end this formal part of it is that when there's always issues no matter where you're at in a career-wise, but when it all comes together, particularly in the agencies where you're taking science and applying it to solving a particular problem or an issue, and you see the results of what you're doing, that is tremendously rewarding career-wise. When I first went to Parks and Wildlife, I intended to stay there for about 3 years to help them set up what was called the Environmental Protection Division. But I ended up there 23 years because it was so rewarding. And so there are many options going forward as you're looking past your PhD, getting your PhD and looking forward there. Academia, yes, it's wonderful. I enjoy that too. It's a wonderful opportunity to expand and do things that you might want to do, but don't discount the going forward with working with agencies and outside agencies in private industry and NGOs and this type of thing, and taking that science that you can learn and applying it to solving problems. It's a great opportunity. So with that, I appreciate your listening, and Tacey, I'm going to figure out how to get off my.
I think you can just hit stop sharing, but.
Well, I'm looking for that and it's not showing up for some reason.
I think if not.
Oh, here it is. I got it. There.
Okay, I was like, I think Allie might do it manually. All right, well, thank you very much. That was a really interesting presentation, and I enjoy hearing about sort of all the options and things, because I do think as graduate students, we're so heavy into our research that sometimes maybe we miss out on some of the information about new opportunities or options or just agency information in general. We did have a few submitted questions prior to this webinar series, not in the chat necessarily today. But if you did submit a question and you would like to answer it or ask it in person, please raise your hand and Allie can unmute you. But otherwise, I do have questions from a few people who are not here, so we might as well start with that. Mm-hmm. And this one seems pretty relevant for sort of your expertise level. And Norman, if you have some commentary, feel free to chime in and sort of jump and add some 2 cents. But Kelsey Tannenbaum submitted the question just recently, I think yesterday, before this was sort of uploaded. And her question was, how do you see, or what do you see as current impacts or effects of local and state government decisions in the marine world out of Texas specifically?
The local effect, ask you one more time, make sure I get it right.
How and what do you see as current impacts or effects of local and state governments on the marine world from Texas?
Yeah, from the local side of types of things, one of the issues that we're looking at mostly, for the most part, is actually, and people begin to understand this, is the impacts of climate change on local environments and this type of thing from the local government. Really, I've seen them evolve over the last several years to begin to understand that climate change is very real, and issues of how they protect shorelines and infrastructure, wastewater treatment plants, roads, and this type of thing. It's really becoming an issue. So they need to understand that and how to work in that area. So they're becoming and my point is they're becoming much more active, much more acclimated to trying to work with scientific communities to understand what's going on so they can respond more appropriately. And I do find that to be the same for the most part in state agencies. State agencies, if you say climate change, and so they don't all run for cover anymore. They're actually groups like the General Land Office, which has a coastal resiliency plan, which is looking at how we deal with these types of issues. So I think it has improved significantly, and they're really important players. Both local and state agencies are obviously in our states really important. and they work very closely with the federal agencies in many cases, but in some cases they don't. But nonetheless, they are very active in that regard. So I'm happy to see that.
Awesome. And then I had actually a few questions and things. You've talked about sort of getting involved in state agencies and things like that, and that avenue outside of academia. But if you stay in academia, right, say you actually do enter this tenured position and are conducting a lot of this research, what do you feel like is sort of the best avenue to communicate and incorporate that research at a state and a local decision-making level?
Yeah, and that's still a little bit of a difficult issue in that for the most part, if you're in academia, and that's something, as I said, the way you are evaluated for a tenure position and going forward are typically your papers you published and research you've gathered and students that you have helped through the system, and those are fine, and that's really important. The universities play a really important role in that. I don't want to dismiss that, but still, if you're interested in going outside that sphere and taking your science and really on solving problems, getting involved locally, you don't get much credit for that, and in some cases you still get discouraged. So I think it's a matter of making sure that where you're at, if you have a position, that you understand that really clearly, that if that's really important to you, that before you take a position, you need to understand, can you actually do that? Will you get credited for that, or will it not work that way for you? So it's just something you have to try to understand. And I think what I'm seeing more of these days is more universities are expanding in that area. They're understanding that it's important that universities play that important role to be relevant to the communities that surround them and to the state, that they bring many resources to help solve really important problems. And so I think I see that improving, so that so they are more tolerant, perhaps even more encouraging of faculty participating in that way. And so I hope that that's the case.
Great. I did see a hand get raised and then unraised. Is there somebody that would like to answer a question or ask a question? I think Sam, Allie, if you could unmute her, that would be great. If I can do that.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I typed in the chat, but you mentioned receiving some backlash at some of your research findings, but what has caused the most backlash in your career so far?
Let's see. Well, most currently, for example, the idea of desalination has been a very controversial issue here in our part of the state, and the idea and what this is surrounding water. And I think the whole issue of water is certainly a critical one, and so that's one area where there's so many competing uses for water between agriculture, business, and municipalities and this type of thing, and there's not enough water in the state. That trying to make a slot for environmental water has been a significant challenge. And so if you're an advocate for the environmental water, that means you're taking water from others as well. And so that has been the nastiest fight, I guess I would say, in some sense, dealing with water issues around the state, just because it is so important to everything that we do.
Thank you.
Great. Does anybody else have a question they'd like to ask? I feel like we had a few questions that were submitted that kind of cross both of these presentations. So I was going to wait until the end to sort of bring them up, and then we can have both speakers give their sort of 2 cents. I think one question that David Wood submitted, though, could be something that's relevant. If David, if you'd like to answer or ask your question in person, go ahead and raise your hand. Otherwise, I can do it for you. Give him a few seconds to decide.
I don't remember what my question was.
Perfect. I can ask it for you. You submitted in the chat just asking how the majority of land in Texas being privately owned affects sort of this incorporation of research into policy, things like that.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question, because it is, and And I think it varies depending on what the issue is. For example, when I look at the Laguna Madre and Padre Island National Seashore and the land, not the National Seashore, but the lands behind it, which are all privately owned, and I see them still mostly undeveloped and in support of the Laguna itself. And then when I go over to Florida and see what would be a similar area, and particularly now after the hurricane, how that has been developed and and that type of thing. So that's where we've actually benefited from the private land side of things. But there are issues in that regard with endangered species that has been very controversial in how you deal with private lands, because not having large chunks of like public lands like they do in many Western states where you can act on a bigger scale, you have to work with those private landowners. And so it has made it more complicated, but hasn't made it impossible. And so in some cases, those private landowners have actually banded together, and it's been really, really beneficial. But it is different and a different approach. So I'm probably just dancing all around the circle there, but I think my answer is that it is varied. Unfortunately, I can't give you a straight answer. I think some of it works really well. In other cases, it has been more difficult. So it's a mixed bag, but not impossible. And in some cases, it really has been beneficial.
Great, thank you so much. If anybody else has any other questions, we can go ahead and ask them now. We can also open up questions to both panelists towards the end, since it looks like we might have a little bit of extra time. But if nobody has any other questions, we can sort of move on to our next speaker and maybe come back to some of these topics. It sounds like a plan. Great. All right. Mr. Norman Garza, are you ready? Fantastic. All right. So just a quick introduction before we get started. Mr. Garza joined the Texas A&M University as Vice President of Government Relations in June 2021. In this role, he leads implementation of congressional and legislative initiatives through coordination with the Texas A&M University System, federal and state relations offices, which is located in Washington, D.C. and Austin, Texas. Prior to this role, Norman was an Assistant Vice Chancellor of Government Relations for Texas A&M Engineering beginning in 2014. And he was previously an Associative Legislative Director for Texas Farm Bureau from 2008 to 2014, as well as the Deputy Chief of Staff for a state senator from 2006 through 2008. Born in Harlingen and raised in Pleasanton, Norman is a native Texan with roots across the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. And he earned his bachelor's degree in political science from St. Edward's University. He also completed a semester-long program studying international relations and South American economic political affairs at Universidad de Belgrano in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And if you'd like to sort of continue from there, go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. Howdy. So I'll just remind everybody here, I am not a researcher. You're looking at a poli-sci grad working around state government and politics. So I'll start by just laying the precursor that I try to translate a lot of the speak that comes from our researchers, both on the faculty side, as well as some of the student researchers that are involved in various programs of interest across the street here in Austin at the state capitol and also up in DC. So I kind of approached this opportunity to visit with y'all today by giving you an inside view of how I actually do the job that I was hired to do, which is utilizing all of the smart information that's coming from folks like yourselves that are spending copious amounts of time creating the right kind of information and then helping to translate it from scientific speak to English, and then from English speak to Texan, and then from Texan over to the interests from the policymakers, particularly at the state capitol. And so, as Tracy mentioned, my portfolio for A&M included specifically the engineering world. That includes these logos that you see on my wall, TEAS, TEACS, and TTI, as well as the College of Engineering. But now with my new role, when President Banks became, or Dr. Banks became the president, I've had exposure to the entire campus and getting to know all of the different programs that are available in the other colleges and schools as well. And so I just wanted to commend y'all for taking time to engage in a conversation such that Tracy and the others have organized. To be completely honest, that's truly what I believe academics is supposed to enable, which is that conversation for decision points when it comes to public policy priorities. And the best way to justify whether it's an investment, dollars truly, perhaps from the legislature or from the Congress, is with the right information and the facts that is based upon research, in my opinion. And I'll give you a couple of examples. And so I'll kind of go off the lineup, Tracy, just a little bit, so forgive me in advance. But I want to draw your attention to a real world opportunity where both student and faculty researchers that I've been able to work with has had a direct impact for the state of Texas over at the Texas Capitol. One of the, and I know we've got some non-Aggies on the line, so bear with me if you don't mind, please indulge this example. But one of the benefits of the Texas A&M University system is we've got state agencies in addition to our various academic campuses across the state. 11 colleges or universities rather across the state, including the flagship and College Station. And then we've got 3 state agencies that belong to the M side of A&M, in my opinion, on the engineering side, and one of which is the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. And then we've got 4 on the agriculture side, or the A side, which many folks are more familiar with, particularly because Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Office is present in nearly all 254 counties across the state. And then most recently, this kind of is of direct interest to your conversation about science policy in particular. Most recently, the Texas legislature moved the Texas Division of Emergency Management, that acronym is TDEM, which is the state level of FEMA. That's the way I like to describe it. They moved that state agency out from the Texas Department of Public Safety, or DPS, into the Texas A&M University system, and therefore became the 8th state agency under the A&M system banner. But back to TTI, the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, headquartered in College Station on the Rellis campus outside of Bryan. It also has several offices around the state. And those offices were stood up in particular to assist the local decision makers, whether that was their city council or their county commissioners court or their local organizations such as the Metropolitan Planning Organization and other RMAs, the regional mobility authorities, that are helping to come up with what the plans are moving forward in the future for congestion mitigation and transit needs, both in the rural and urban suburban parts of the state. And so over time, there were several state senators in particular who were very familiar with the work that the researchers at TTI were able to produce because of that local engagement that they first learned TTI had, perhaps when that senator could have been first a city councilman or a county commissioner before they made it through their career up to the legislature. And so dollars were actually appropriated in the General Appropriations Act for TTI to work on very specific projects that was research-based, that created the justification behind future investments made by the legislature, whether it was how much to give TxDOT, the Texas Department of Transportation, for new road design or actual construction projects or maintenance upgrades for various safety needs on perhaps a bridge or a dam or something else around the state. So I wanted to give you a very real world concrete example of how scientific research, while this example was applicable to the transportation sector, truly has a direct correlation both at the state capitol as well as originating from needs that are drawn from a local example. And I guess what I'm trying to convey is often action only occurs when something super tragic or very terrible is underway. So if you've ever driven through the different parts of Dallas-Fort Worth Austin, Houston, even San Antonio, and currently my experience down in the Rio Grande Valley around our McAllen campus, traffic can get really bad on those interstate roadways and state highways. So because of that local problem, the action then matriculates up such that there's a high demand signal at the Capitol that is fed by the locals and informed by research and researchers in order for those decisions to be made. So there's one example, and I'm happy to get into more of the weeds on it through the Q&A at the end, but I'll kind of try to go back to the format that Tracy outlined for us to follow. So hard to follow Dr. McKinney, but I do not have a PowerPoint presentation. So I'm hopeful that you'll indulge me in just a couple of more comments. And then I'd really like to leave enough time at the end for some dialogue with Q&A. But one of the first questions posed by Tracy was, what are some of the barriers when it comes to translating or even sharing, for that matter, the science research into the policy decision realm, if you will. And I'll start by describing what maybe is very basic to most of y'all, but what I've observed to be a high challenge for the general public writ large, which is often they don't know what question to ask. Often they don't know what words are the best in order to convey a question such that the right thought can be given for a decision to be made. And what I mean by that is if you've got a worst case scenario at that local level, folks are usually going to just talk about it, whether it's the construction on 35 that's the problem trying to get through the Waco Temple area or otherwise for that matter. They're going to usually pinpoint a specific point in time because that's what they remember experiencing. But failing to pause and ask a broader question beyond just that one point in time can or has been my observation with what barriers lie in translating or sharing scientific research for policy decision makers. I'll put on my previous hat. Tracy mentioned that in the past I worked for the Texas Farm Bureau on their legislative affairs team, and in that sense, I got to work a lot on landowner issues, water. Back to that conversation from Larry, I'll never forget at an early age, my dad saying, whiskey's for drinking, but water is for fighting over. And that truly still is the sense today in Texas. So when it comes to trying to help somebody, for example, who is a member of the Texas Farm Bureau, they're an agriculture producer in their day job. They might be a member of this organization because of various benefits that are afforded to them through that association, and one of which is policy, regulatory, legislative matters. But when they're pinpointing a very specific issue, for example, a transmission line coming across their ranch in the hill country because they're trying to get that line connected from the generator and the transformer, if you will, in different parts of the state. All that landowner typically would talk about is who came knocking on their door, trying to get some contract signed when it comes to an eminent domain matter, perhaps, or otherwise, rather than stopping to think of it from a much broader perspective. And those are plentiful in terms of examples that I could give to you from my experience there. But what I would often do is sit down with that Farm Bureau member, that landowner, and listen, of course, to their immediate frustration, and then help them realize, okay, there's a couple of words that we're not using. There's a couple of questions or phrases that can be incorporated to ask the right question, and that will get the attention of perhaps a county commissioner or a state legislator. And then let's go correlate with maybe there's a court case that's involved and what science was used from a factual basis under those proceedings. In order to come back and inform the legislature to consider perhaps either creating a new statute or amending an existing law that would be perhaps a recourse for that landowner. So the first, in terms of barriers, is I'd encourage you all to always share your broad knowledge with perhaps a lot of the laymen, whether it's just average Joe Jane citizen or truly somebody that's working over at an agency, to help them understand there's other words that should be used. Let's create the right organization of those words to ask the best question to accomplish a conversation and ultimately a decision. So that's the first thing I would share with y'all. The second that Tracy asked about was avenues to be involved. I always encourage folks when it's coming to the point of a policy decision to be made that will really have an impact on the daily lives of yourself, your family, your friends, or the general public writ large, to start at the local level. Another good phrase that I've never forgotten is all politics is local. So while folks might remember that How to Write a Bill cartoon caricature about going to Washington, D.C., it's not there before something happened in someone's backyard across the street or down the road. So the best way to get involved is at the local level, whether it's the regional planning committees for water, for transportation, for infrastructure writ large. There's always going to be some official capacity on behalf of government, be that state or local, that you can volunteer to be part of. And often, because of your subject matter expertise, you will be more than welcomed in those settings so that you can participate in the conversation and help them organize the right question and inform them in the conversation before it gets to How to Write a Bill caricature in DC or Austin, for that matter. So always start local, get involved with those regional workshops and otherwise that might be available to your respective research disciplines. And then that's a kind of a segue into how to find a job if you wanted to do this for a living, truly applying your scientific-based research to the public policy realm. That is a big gap, in my opinion, for for society writ large, to be completely honest. You can have as many folks that are poli-sci majors and want to help affect the process when it comes to a variety of issues, but always there's that need for justification. And the best justification is research, because ultimately dollars are going to be involved. And if you aren't basing a decision for investing public dollars on some solid information, i.e. research, then there's always going to be that Achilles heel that someone who's not happy with the decision about what is being made available via those public funds can attack either a legislator, a committee, a commission, whoever that authority entity is on doling out the dollars. So I would absolutely encourage y'all to find every avenue possible to apply your work and knowledge and skills when it comes to that public policy realm. But you don't necessarily only need to consider pathways through public entities such as a state agency or otherwise. There's plenty of consulting type companies, and you can use your imagination on the span of salary scales that might be available to you from a state agency versus a private consulting like firm. So I would encourage y'all to do that. And a good way to kind of start assessing what that private sector market might look like is there's always government bids that are being let, whether that's from TxDOT or Parks and Wildlife or the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ, even the Railroad Commission when it comes to a lot of the energy, natural gas, oil type sector issues. Those agencies will issue RFIs, RFPs, there's bidding opportunities available. If y'all spend time just looking at what those are on a quarterly basis, for a lack of a better frequency, you'll start to get a handle on what the issues are that are requiring the kind of information that y'all are likely able to provide pending your various research disciplines and subject matter expertise. And then you'll naturally find what are the firms that really start to be aggressively competing for those opportunities? Are they based in Dallas or Houston? Are they based out of state? Do they have a good reputation? Do they hire from certain schools over others? I would encourage y'all to not only look at state agency commission agendas, but also those bids that they might be letting in order to get a handle on the kinds of jobs where your skills would be useful. Moving on, there was that question on privately owned lands. I have it on my list here, but I think it's been covered. And I even went into a little of the conversation with my past experience at Farm Bureau. But there's others, from the cattle raisers to the Wildlife Association to a handful of others across the state that really do help to lend that voice for a majority of the state that is privately owned to kind of have a collective agenda, if you will. But there are a handful out there who are some families or individuals that own large acreage and certainly have a selfish perspective, but I don't mean that in a negative light by any means. They're truly looking after what it is their unique operation might be for maximizing the highest and best use value of their property. Happy to get into the weeds on that on Q&A if anybody has other thoughts or questions on it. Let's see. How does government relations use the scientific research? I just wanted to double down on those examples. T's, TX, AgriLife, Vet Med, you name it. All of the different state agencies that fall under the A&M banner, the system brand, has a high demand signal from state agencies and legislators for information. Often through a passage of a bill, for example, or a budget rider in the Appropriations Act, a study might be required on a certain topic. And so it's not just that somebody's interested in some information, it's the law that it has to be written. So I've got to believe that Dr. McKinney has been involved in some of those studies in the past over his tenure, either at the agency and other affiliations, but that's a perfect example of something that is actually required by law to be produced. And so that's the best way, obviously, for policy considerations to be informed, is when it's a requirement for some entity to issue a report or conduct a study and ultimately release the findings that turn into recommendations, and recommendations often become new pieces of legislation the following session. As a reminder, sidebar here, the Texas legislature meets every odd number year for 140 days between January and May. So it's called a part-time legislature, for better or worse. And they write all of the bills, and they take into consideration action for implementation, or passage rather for implementation, but they also have to simultaneously make decisions when it comes to the budget. Other states do things a little differently. They have a very unique system whereby for a certain amount of time, their legislature meets just to consider their budget and all of the ancillary inputs involved with those decision points. And then they'll meet in addition on a different time scale to just take up matters of general law. For better or worse, in Texas, it's condensed simultaneously to 140 days. I always give the example that the first 2 months is a family reunion, and then eventually people need to go take naps after maybe the meal at a family reunion. And so there's a little downtime come March, but then everybody gets back together. And by then either personalities are starting to jive, or they're starting to butt heads directly during April as they get to that final stretch of May. But it is certainly something, if you've never experienced before, to pay a little more attention to. Not necessarily by coming to Austin or DC or going to your county courthouse for that matter, or down to City Hall to be involved. Often, I think, especially through the pandemic, live streaming is now a thing, and certain publications or online media outlets do a pretty good job of covering the play-by-play and ultimately the decisions made. In Texas, I'll call one out in particular, right? Two, I suppose. One is the Texas Tribune. If you're not familiar with that organization and news affiliate, I would encourage you all to browse their website. They do a pretty good job at presenting the facts of topics at hand in the present mode, especially during session. The other is called the quorum report, and there are federal DC entities that are similar to what I just mentioned, but these two in particular are more Texas-based. So if you're interested in getting a little bit of a handle on it, there's a free subscription that you can go to both Quorum Report as well as Texas Tribune and start to follow. So I think the final thought was how to educate local policymakers when it comes to some of the research topics that you might have underway. Not only do I go back to that local regional workshop kind of work group examples, but I'd also encourage you all to, if you really do pursue that pathway, start finding who the this is going to sound bad, but there are bureaucrats that work in different capacities, right? And I don't mean that in a negative light. There are folks that work in the public works division of a city or a county. There are program managers at a state agency. If you get to know those individuals, they really are the ones who are making sure that whatever is required by law or whatever is being considered by the governing board, whether it's a commission or a council or otherwise, is addressed accordingly to the intent of the consideration being afforded through the public policy domain. And so those individuals, those bureaucrats, if you will, the policy analysts and the budget advisors and folks that are program managers for various divisions and initiatives, they are looking for people like y'all to use as their subject matter experts when it comes to incorporating information, digesting an analysis, if you will, and ultimately coming up with a recommendation. So it might seem like a strange pathway to dip your toes into, but that's definitely always a good pathway, in my opinion, to get to the right folks, to just let them know who you are and what you know, and find out how they might want to use that information. And then just writ large, ultimately, I'll just share, you always have, this is applicable to life in general as well. You always have one opportunity to make that first impression, and then the value of your reputation is what will stick with you. And so you've clearly decided that research is an important field, if you will, in your respective lives. And I would just share that always approach an opportunity such that your reputation personally, your work professionally, will never be attacked, separate than those folks who might just have a different opinion. Back to Larry's example of folks that have reached out to him on different occasions. Just always approach your methodologies very, very carefully, and the value of your brand, whether it's your name or the institution that you received your academic credentials from, or the place that you work and publish your findings and your work. Just always make sure that you keep that very, very clean and clear, because at the end of the day, the last thing you want to do is fight to restore your good name when it comes to scientific research that can often blend too closely with passion from a personal perspective that sometimes gets brought into the conversation. That's my observation. Fortunately, it hasn't happened to me, back to being just a poli-sci major, but I have observed that occur to others, and it's never pretty. So I'll pause there. I'm not sure. I think maybe we're already over time. Sorry, Tracy, but I'll pause there for any questions or reactions and participate in Q&A further. Thanks.
I think you're actually perfectly on time. So great job. And thank you very much for that really interesting sort of talk. I think as people in the scientific sector, right, we don't generally get to sort of hear about some of the more policy focused work that's going on at the university level specifically. If anybody does have a question, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll sort of go through some of the questions that I have recorded already and or have maybe sort of keep track of, and then maybe we can do a few where both you and Larry are open to sort of answering. So you mentioned, right, that being engaged with some of those more local policymakers or decision makers or people that have a stake in some of these solutions is a really great way to, I guess, utilize science to educate some of these people, right? But how, as a student, sort of is that possible, right? I think that most of us recognize that it's an important part, but it's very hard to maybe make those connections if you don't already have a foot in the door or some sort of actual maybe introduction by someone else, right? So what's sort of a good way as graduate students or just scientists in general to sort of make some of those initial foot in the door kind of opportunities?
Sure. Not being a professor, maybe this is where Larry can come in to supplement the response, but my immediate reaction is you don't always have to interject into the conversation. So while it might be an interest to you for engaging, and then you realize, well, I don't know who to call, first stop to ask yourself, what value do you bring to the conversation, whoever's ears you're trying to get to listen to you, versus just talking and sharing your knowledge from a student perspective. And I don't mean that in a negative light. What I mean is find the right opportunity to really kind of bang on the door to get the right folks' attention versus just a blanket going door to door, for an example, by passing out a resume versus finding that right ear. And the best way to realize, in my opinion, a pathway is to listen, read what is going on at that local level that's turning into a cause of action that you actually have information about, and then realize who is already part of that conversation. Is it city council? Is it a county commission? Is it a state legislator? Is it a state agency? And then go and insert yourself into the conversation that has already has legs, if you will, versus trying to create the legs and get your information out there. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And I think we have sort of a similar follow-up question from Debelina. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask it yourself, or I can ask it for you. It's completely up to you.
You can go ahead and ask. And thanks, Norman, for the excellent presentation.
Perfect. So you want me to ask? Sorry, just clarifying.
Yes, please.
Okay. So she posted in the chat, what is the best approach, either from a top down, like Austin, DC level, or bottom up, city councils, mayors, etc., for engaging with community decision makers? So once maybe that's already been established, what's the best process?
Yeah, good segue, like you said, Tracy. Good question. Thank you. I always go back to the politics is local when it's coming to gain attention by policymakers. I would certainly encourage folks to start bottom up in terms of your question. But if there is no traction by starting at the bottom and working your way up to those higher levels of government, don't just stop because you didn't get a reaction or engagement opportunity with a city councilman, for example. But what you can say later, when you do go to a senator or somebody else at a higher governmental entity, you can say, I already tried to get so-and-so's attention. I already tried to have a conversation with so-and-so at the local level, so that they don't use it as an initial reaction to you and say, passing the buck here, you should start with so-and-so, back home. So when it comes to certain topics that truly are applicable at that local level. So I always like to approach from a strategic level, a conversation that somebody's not going to shut the door on me, right? So if I'm trying to have that conversation with an appropriator, for example, at the legislature, and they say, well, did you just dream up this idea and you just came up with, $4 million or $40 million as the ask? Tell me where you're basing this from. As a matter of fact, I've got so-and-so already, I've already talked to so-and-so and this organization and this issue happened over here and all that kind of stuff. So I guess I would just encourage you to not think about starting from the bottom up as the wrong strategic approach, because ultimately it can be used in your advantage from a communication standpoint to say, I've already thought about that and I tried it and I got nowhere. Now it's on you, sir or ma'am. So there's my reaction for what it's worth.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I think we have one more question that's probably maybe more on your side of the information system. Ricky had posted a chat previously, or a question when registration was open, about what barriers exist between state and local government that inhibit this policymaking process, like what maybe might stall or prevent certain policies from moving forward between a local and state sort of level of organization.
Sure. In my opinion, funding is always the barrier. Whatever the issue is, it comes down to who has the money, who wants to make the decision, and why it's needed. So in order for funding to not be the barrier, you've got to have all of the I's dotted and T's crossed from a communication standpoint, from a research justification standpoint, to stakeholder engagement, participation standpoint, all of those things, because at the end of the day, in order for a decision to be made and change to occur, funding is required. At least that's my experience. If anybody has another one, I'm happy to hear, but that's been my experience. So funding is the answer to the question of what the main barrier is. I led off in my conversation about what the barrier has been in my observation of asking the right question, because in order for funding decisions to be made, a question has to be answered, words have to be put together in the correct fashion based on something that is occurring across the whole state, in one city or otherwise. But at the end of the day, the decision point for change or implementation of a decision often comes down to funding as a barrier, in my observation.
Perfect, thank you. And I have maybe 2 or so questions left that are probably a better maybe split between Larry, both you and Norman, if you both want to sort of chime in and maybe give your 2 cents on some of these options. The first is sort of what avenues are there for scientists to be involved or advise environmental decision making at this local and state level, right? I know that both of you sort of touched on some of these options, but maybe like what would you sort of recommend aside from just being a part of the conversation? Are there other ways aside from maybe just presenting your research that are helpful to sort of be involved from a scientist with that expert sort of experience or testimony?
That's a good avenue for me to actually interject something that Norm, I really appreciate your presentations and talk about it. And you really hit off on something that I wanted to remind on, particularly relate to your science behind you, for example. And Tacy, you asked that question of how, if you want to remain in academia, how could you participate or be in the policy side of things? And interestingly, for a university like A&M, land grant type of thing, we have organizations, Sea Grant being one of the main ones, but TEAS and the Ag Extension, where it's a group that transcends. They have scientists and they have ways to take science and actually apply it to solving problems. So there are a number of avenues there that you can take advantage of, I think, and I don't want to forget that. I think all of those are very unique opportunities from an academic standpoint. If you really are interested in staying in academia, there's still a mechanism to get involved in that, called applied or directed science side of things. So.
Do you have anything to add, Norman?
Sorry, I was finding the unmute button. No, ma'am. I think I've kind of hit a little bit on that previous, but there's other questions. Happy to participate.
Okay, so I have one question, because I feel like this is what I've been learning, right? Obviously, as a person trained in academia, primarily, I am sort of just beginning my foray into the policy sphere and this sort of intersection between these 2 fields. And I found when talking with a lot of people that maybe are experts on a policy side or a legal side and maybe work at a state level, that every state has different priorities, right? The national priorities are also different from a state and local priorities. So I guess from a Texas standpoint, right, how does the state or local region decide on what those major environmental or scientific priorities actually are, right? Like, how do we get to the point where there's a conversation, as you said, Norman, with legs already sort of attached, right? Like, how does that come about?
I think Larry's had a direct experience with this kind of a question, so I'll let him start and I'll supplement if necessary.
Kind of rephrase again, kind of what you're getting at. How can you participate, and how do local entities decide how to move forward? Is that what you're?
Yeah, pretty much like, how does something become a major issue of concern for like a state or local region, right? How does something turn into something with a policy force behind it?
Yeah, well, it's interesting in various ways, but I'm always reminded of, I think it was Margaret Mead's thing about the role of individuals and small groups of individuals. And the question is, how could one individual or small group of individuals actually have any influence? And her response was, no, yes, they can. In fact, that's the only way anything ever gets done is when a small dedicated group of or an individual acts. And I've seen that happen in the legislature a lot. I've sat in long committees or on a controversial issue, and an individual gets up and can communicate whatever that issue is, and it lights up those legislators, and they get it. And all of a sudden things change. And I've seen that happen many times. So there is an avenue for individual action. But I think what you see in a lot is that at local levels, individuals are far more impactful and local issues, environmental issues type of thing. As you move to the state level, it's sometimes individuals, but mostly groups. And by the time you get to the federal level, having an organization behind you and working within that organization is what's critical. So I think there's so it is variable. And of course, you have the state agencies, Parks and Wildlife, the General Land Office, TCEQ, Water Development Board. They are always going out trying to look at issues that need to be addressed. The Department of Ag and Health, all of them have efforts that go out and seek what are the big issues that we need to be dealing with to get ahead of time. I mean, COVID and things like these are types of issues that agencies have their own view, own approach of trying to sort out and take action on. So, but there's always a role for the individual to go forward and do it. And I think outside of academia, if you're as a scientist, some of these organizations are always looking for someone who has a scientific background to help them get to those facts. They understand what they may feel, but they need to have, as Norm really, I said, articulated really well, you need to make sure that you're starting from a sound science base. And so there's where, as an individual scientist, you can participate in local groups to help, make sure they're starting from that base, so that as you move forward, you're working on a real basis of trying to solve real problems and not getting off on tangents that are not productive.
And I'll tag on just a little bit. Often, as citizen Norm here, I hate getting email or a phone call for a survey, but you know what? State agencies and local entities, organizations and otherwise, use surveys in order to help inform what those conversations develop into that ultimately becomes an actionable conversation. So from the scientific perspective, I've got to believe that most folks on this call might be more affable to participate in that kind of opportunity, more so than myself, for example. And so I would just share as a reminder that there are those different work groups and such across the state in particular, from a regional and even a very local county level, that y'all can identify opportunities to subscribe to a listserv or whatever, fill out that survey, be part of the conversation when it comes time to somebody saying, oh, this person over here said this, sounds like we should, follow up on it. And then there's the opportunity where you're invited into the conversation. So there's a very basic example, but I know it happens often.
Great. I think that's all of the questions I have, and it doesn't look like we have any other questions that have been submitted. So if you guys, either of you, have any sort of closing or final remarks you'd like to make, I think now would be a sort of great time to have that. And if not,
just want to appreciate the opportunity to visit with you, and Norm and I to help kind of start this. But I've looked down your agenda of your upcoming sessions, and they look really good, and they're going to they provide a lot more detail than Norm and I kind of covered some general overview types of things. But I think you've really got a good program going forward, and I appreciate you doing this for our students and getting that together, because it's really important. Having, as both of us have tried to say, is that the ability to take the science that we're all develop and translate it into actions and policies is where it's really important. That's what makes all the difference in the world. And so those, all of you that are on this forum, actually, obviously you're interested in that. So I encourage you to stick with it and be as active as you can. But thanks for the opportunity to do this.
I agree. The only thing I'll add is if you've got the chance before you graduate to maybe do an internship or a fellowship or otherwise, either in Austin, DC, or at an agency, even at the local level, highly encourage you to spend time doing that. At the very least, it'll either inform you on this ain't my cup of tea at all, or it'll help give you a little bit more encouragement to take a few more bites at the apple, if you will. So kudos to everybody. Tracy knows how to get in touch with Larry and I. If you've got any follow-up questions afterwards, be happy to bird dog those via email.
Perfect. I think we do have one last question in the chat if you guys want to answer this really quickly. And I think both of you have touched on this, but just, any advice moving, if you do want to sort of switch gears, so 180 degrees, moving from academia into policy, do you guys have any last minute sort of advice on that front?
I think Norm really hit it on one, which I think is a really good one, is that give it a try. There are intern opportunities, if not that volunteer, but give it a try to make sure that's really what you want to do, and then go for it. But don't hesitate to jump into it. That's what I would say. And there are opportunities to do this, to take the trial.
Agreed. In particular, I'd just make the reminder, the Texas legislature meets, like I said, odd number years. So that will be in the spring semester of this academic year. If it works for your rotation through your classes and such and your graduation matriculation, do that. My second piece of advice, if you do go down that pathway, is if you want to stick to more of that scientific conversation, work at a committee office, not in a member's office. For example, the senator has their main office for their constituents and the general public in the Capitol, but then there's this whole suite down in the extension where he or she might actually be a chairman or a vice chairman or a member of a committee of jurisdiction on a certain topic that might be of interest to you. So if you don't want to get bombarded with all of the school groups and every other activist kind of engagement that occurs at the Capitol, work in a committee to get that experience when it comes to that internship or fellowship opportunity. And don't think that all of them are unpaid. There are several opportunities for paid positions as well. But that's the best way to just get your sense before graduating on whether or not you kind of want to go down that path, just to be a little bit more specific on the answer.
Fantastic. I really appreciate both of you participating. I think it's a really important topic, and getting some of those, wide perspectives makes a really nice, well-rounded education still at a graduate level, right? That maybe we might not get otherwise. But I just want to thank you both for coming. For anybody that's still here, just a reminder, our next seminar or webinar is going to be 2 weeks from today, same time, and we're going to transition more from that local focus to a federal focus and appropriations conversation. So how maybe those systems operate at a more sort of bird's eye view level for the United States in general. And these recordings will be recorded and they will be emailed out to everyone that has attended. So make sure you are attending them if you can. And if you can't attend, you're still welcome to sign up, so you do get a copy of those recordings. And we're very happy to help you sort of become more involved. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And I'm sure our speakers are more than happy to sort of engage and communicate if you have specific questions for them as well. But thank you very much for coming, and we really appreciate you taking your time on this wonderful Tuesday afternoon. I hope to see you both, or many of you, not both of you, in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much.